All right. Hey, everybody. I'm Steven, and I'm super excited to be here today. Thanks, the Belgian crew, for organizing a conference in Paris. It's super nice of you. And I'm here today to talk about React components as a service. So I'll explain what that means. That might not be very clear at first. But before I do this, I would like to share a personal story that I've never really shared publicly before. It's kind of related to what he said earlier. So I always loved computers and like playing around with computers and hacking around ever since my parents got us a PC in our house. And shout out to my mom, she sent me this picture. This was probably like a year or two after we got that PC. I don't know if there are any older people here, but this is what it used to look like. And I loved it. Like, I started hacking around, playing games, and I just loved, like, I was, going into Microsoft Word, playing with, like, how to do designs and typing. I just loved using that thing. But growing in a small town in south of France, Rodez, I don't know if you guys know where that is, southwest, near Toulouse. I never realized there could be a career at the intersection of like code and design and like that passion that I built. Fast forward 2011, I decided to move to Sydney, like a lot of French people do. Eventually, after studying, they moved to Sydney for fun. So that's what I wanted to do. Moved there, barely spoke the language. I had very little money in my pocket. And I remember two days after arriving, I went to the mall and I handed my resume to like every single store, right? I had to find a job because I was not gonna be able to live there. I probably handed over like 100 resumes. Nobody called me back, except one person. They called me. I couldn't understand what they said, but I knew that I had to come the next day to work for them. And I arrived and I discovered what the job was going to be. And it was a churros stand. I don't know if do you know what churros are? It's like those little Spanish thingy. They taste very good. And basically what I was doing all day was just doing this and cutting churros. And very far away from tech. And that got pretty repetitive. And eventually I ended up finding a place to live. I ended up finding a job as a waiter at a French restaurant. Finding some friends. I found a basketball team. I always played basketball my entire life, except now I kind of stopped. But 2 months into the season playing basketball, I remember going to the basket, and somebody kind of pushed me in the air, and I landed super awkwardly on my leg. And I dislocated my leg completely. It wasn't fun. I managed to get a picture of that, so that was me. And I'm not drinking anything here on that picture. This is some kind of painkiller thingy. And that was really tough. I remember they put my leg back in place, going to the hospital. And the thing is that I couldn't really walk for like about a month. And as I said earlier, I barely had any money at the time. And I was like, OK, what am I going to do? So I couldn't work anymore. I went to the hospital again a week later to get an MRI, to get my leg scanned. And I remember the lady at the front told me, all right, it's going to be $600. And I was like, whew, shit, that's like a lot of money. That's basically all I had. I probably had $1,000 or $2,000 in my account. And I basically had given most of that away just for a stupid leg injury. And I was like, OK, I still had to deal with insurance. I still had to figure out how to pay rent. I had to figure out, how I'm going to go through this experience. So I sat down and thought, what am I going to do? But first, that's kind of how I felt. My Australian dream was basically gone 2 months into Sydney, super excited, but then I'm like, oh, shit, now I can't walk. I have no money, what am I going to do? And so what I did is that I went on Gumtree. So for the French people here, I guess the majority of the audience, that is the equivalent of Le Bon Coin, essentially, in Australia. And I put an ad up to say, OK, well, if you need a website, if you need some designs, I can help you. 3 weeks later, I had a few clients, and I was making more money than I was at my waiter job. I was like, okay, damn. So that clicked for me at that point. I realized that you could have a career at the intersection of design and code, and do both kind of at the same time, which is something I always love to do, not just the code or not just design. And through this, I learned a pretty good thing is that sometimes a bad situation can turn out to be good in retrospect. And this is something I still continue to live by today. And that leads me to this talk today at React Paris, had I not gone through this. Then I ended up living in several different cities around the world and built a passion for creative tools, creating tools that people use to create something out of it. I just love creative tools. That's super inspiring to me. Through that, I ended up working at Messenger, Facebook Messenger, on the design system team and design tooling team to create those tools internally to build all kinds of stuff at Facebook. In Sydney, I worked at a company called Campaign Monitor, where essentially we enabled marketers to design emails that were working on mobile and desktop. And this is the tool that you see here, basically drag and drop, very creative, make it very easy for people to design those emails. And there, I got exposed to a problem and started building a tool called Easy. And Easy was this tool for designers to help them design, take their Photoshop layers and Sketch layers. I don't know if you remember Sketch and Photoshop. Now everybody uses Figma. And you could basically convert those static layers and animate them and get the code without having to code. And it's because of this project, that the CEO of InVision contacted me to join InVision in 2016 to work on a tool called InVision Studio. So who here knows InVision or InVision Studio? A few people, I guess. Cool. So InVision Studio is essentially very similar to Figma. And we basically enabled, it was like a desktop app, and we enabled designers to create apps and websites and animations and that kind of stuff all in one tool. But the sad story is that we basically got crushed by Figma. Figma starting to have a lot of market shares, awesome tool, it was all collaborative in the browser. And that was really tough, because I had dedicated basically 5 years of my life on this, almost. And what was I going to say? Yeah, 5 years on this. And the learning here again is that a bad situation can turn out to be good in retrospect. Because through this experience, I learned something. Basically, we had to take this desktop application that worked on the file system. And because Figma was getting a lot of market shares, we had this project to convert that desktop app into a browser-based app that was fully collaborative with comments and multiplayer and that kind of stuff. And long story short, that took a dedicated team of like 7, 8 people, full-time, a year and a half to do to get the first version. And that was very frustrating to me, because it felt obvious to me that that's how the web should work, and everything should be collaborative by default. Because the web was always meant to be collaborative. And through this, I ended up creating a company with my co-founder Guillaume called Liveblocks, where we essentially help developers like you guys to create collaborative experiences like the ones you experience in tools like Figma, Google Docs, Pitch, et cetera, where you have multiple people and you can work collaboratively together. And I promise this is not a sales speech, right? I'm not going to talk about Liveblocks. This is about to get very practical. And I want to share with you today some tips on how we build some of those React components. And we'll dive into this a little bit later. But first, what does collaboration even mean? It's a broadly used term, but it can have many different meanings to people. And so I'd like to define this. When I talk about collaboration, what people tell me is like, they think about multiplayer stuff, they think about CRDT stuff, local first. We're here is familiar with all that stuff, like multiplayer, local first, CRDT. Anyone played with those technologies? Ah, 2 hands, that's pretty good. But in reality, multiplayer and the local first and CRDT stuff is only the tip of the iceberg. When you build a collaborative app, there's a ton of things to think about. Things like comments, notifications, sharing, audio huddles, the infrastructure itself behind the scenes, permissions, the database that you use. There's a ton of things to think about. And today, we're going to dive into how we can enable some of those features through React components. And more specifically, React components as a service. So, historically, this is what most APIs look like today. This is from Stripe. You usually have some REST endpoint that you hit. In this case, this is to update a customer. And the main thing that's important here is that you interact. This is just JavaScript, right? You require Stripe here, you update your customer, and you pass the metadata, and this is how you update that customer. And obviously, this works with like many different languages, including curl or Go and a bunch more. It's kind of like the default, and this is how you interact with most APIs today. And last year, Colin, the founder and CEO of Clerk, the authentication platform, said, the component is the next gold standard developer tool. And I couldn't agree more with him. With React components, developers get a backend and front-end solution that works seamlessly together in one tidy package. That's one of the big benefits. You don't have to do a backend on one side, the front-end on the side. It's all combined in one thing that works seamlessly together. Developers get a better design that follows the best UX and accessibility practices out of the box. Right? When you ship the UI, you can actually think about the keyboard shortcuts and all that stuff and make sure that all that stuff is working perfectly well. And I think this one is probably less obvious, but you enable front-end teams to move a lot faster because they can ship features autonomously without support from back-end developers. Often if you build an app, then you need to talk to the back-end people, like, oh, OK, I need this endpoint, I need to do this and that. Here, you don't have to do this. You can move faster, and the back-end developers are happier because they don't have to stop whatever they're working on to enable this weird endpoint that you need. OK, this is nice, but where do I start? So what we're about to do now, and I think this is probably the most interesting part for you all, we're going to kind of reverse engineer how we do things at Liveblocks to create those React components. So hopefully you can take this, and if this is relevant at your company, you can take it and basically apply the same principles. So the first thing you want to do is identify a common UI pattern. This is the one thing you want to do first. So in the context of collaboration, there's a ton of things you could look at. So I'm just showing you a few examples here. Comments, if you think about it, if you look at Linear, Figma, Notion, and a bunch of other tools, it's pretty much always the same kind of UX that you have, right? You have a thread, you can leave a comment, you can reply to a thread, you can leave reactions, you can resolve a thread, you can mention people, so those people get notified. Always the same stuff, more or less. Sharing is very similar across most apps, whether you're in Google, Figma, Notion, Pitch, kind of all the same stuff. You have an input, you put the email, you invite people, they get notified. You can also set permissions like can read, can view, or you're the owner of a document, but always pretty much the same patterns. Same thing with notifications, right? If you look at Pitch, Notion, Figma, Linear, they look all very similar. You have an inbox somewhere, and you see the people that mention you in your comment. You see the people that requested access to a document. Very, very similar stuff. And so once you've identified that pattern, I don't know what that could be for your product, you actually want to start building the hooks and the components themselves in code. And when you do that, it is super important to think backwards from the user experience. This is a mistake often that people make. You often think about your system and how the API should be shaped from a practical point of view, from the coding point of view. But what you want is think from the user experience first, and then go backwards from there through to the code and the infrastructure at the end. And so if we look at a commenting panel, if you create something pretty standard, you often have a list of comments. You have a composer where you type your comment. You can add mentions. You can add emojis in there. You have a hit button to send that comment. All the same. You can resolve a thread. You have mentions. And often you have emoji reactions, right? Kind of always the same. And when we take those patterns, those UI patterns, and you want to take them from the technical standpoint, it's interesting to think about it from different levels of abstractions. All the way at the bottom, you have the REST APIs. This is kind of historically what we all use. Little bit over that, you have above that, you have the React hooks. Then you have primitive components and default components. And so a good way to think about it is like if you want to do when you use default components, it's going to be super fast for you to go to production because you literally just have to drop in a component into your React code base. But the customization is going to be a little bit lower. It's going to be less customization. And the more you go down the abstraction levels, the more customization you have, the more you can do, et cetera, et cetera. So let's start with the bottom layer, REST APIs. This is a REST API we have at Liveblocks. I don't know if you have enough contrast, but here you can essentially fetch the threads. So if you want to get the comment thread, you pass the room ID, fetch the threads. That gives you a JSON back with the room ID, the comments that are left, the metadata associated with those comments, when the thread was created. Pretty basic stuff. And with this, you can build pretty much any kind of commenting UI you want, at least to list them. There's obviously a lot more endpoint that we have. But with this, you can basically build whatever you want. Now, let's dive into React hooks. So how can we enable using that REST API through React hooks? Use effect. You fetch a thread in the use effect, and you set the threads in a state. No. No, you don't want to do that. So you definitely don't want to do that. Obviously, when you build a robust application, I mean, in some cases, this can work. But when you build something that's robust, you need to think about a lot of different things. Things like handling suspense, optimistic updates, caching mechanism. In production, you need to think about all those things, obviously. And using use effect would be a little bit too easy, not good enough. So the way we do this at Liveblocks is heavily inspired by those libraries that do this very well. Do you guys know SWR from Vercel or TanStack Query? Yeah, I guess. It's kind of the default, I would say today, to like fetch data. At Liveblocks, we built something very inspired by this, that we don't leverage those tools. And this part alone could be an entire talk, so I didn't want to dive too deep into it. But if you want to dive deeper, here's the QR code. It's on our open source repo. But essentially, the main idea is that we have this useSync external store with selector at the bottom here. This is what we use to kind of handle all the things that I mentioned earlier, like handling suspense, caching mechanism, et cetera, et cetera. So please dive in if that's interesting to you. Now let's get to the fun part. This is kind of my favorite, diving into the components part, because I love design, I like code, and I think this is kind of the layer that becomes very interesting to me. Primitive components. So this layer is actually not always required. If you look at Clerk, that does kind of coin that term, React Components as a service, they don't have primitive components. This one is not mandatory, but I think it's a really good practice to have, because this enables developers to fully customize their UI and use their own design system. So when looking at primitive components, I think it's very important to not reinvent the wheel. And I'm a huge fan at Radix, and everybody at Liveblocks is a fan of Radix. We use Radix all over our dashboard. Who here is familiar with Radix? I'm sure you've used it. Some of you, oh yeah, quite a lot of people. It's essentially this library that's like open source, unstyled, so you get all the components, and it looks like this. If you build a dialog component in Radix, you essentially get those like primitives, dialog root, dialog trigger, portal. Soon we won't need the portal, thanks, Yuna. So that's great. And you basically compose the UI yourself, and you can apply your own design system if you want. And what's nice about this is that this works. Oh, I skipped a slide. This works with any CSS framework. So that's very nice. Here, let's look at what you could take from like what Radix did and what we do at Liveblocks for the composer primitive. So the composer is the part at the bottom of the comment thread that you want to type in. So we have a composer form component with a onComposer submit event handler. We have an editor itself, right, where you can type things. And we have a submit button. And here, you can replace any of those and use your own components. And you can apply your own CSS to it. So that's what's really powerful about it, is that primitive components are compatible with any CSS framework. Whether you use Tailwind or something like that, it will work. So now that we have the REST APIs, hooks, and primitive components, you can use the primitive components to actually provide default components to people that are super powerful, a bit less customizable, but enable them to add a feature working in just like 5 minutes. And so for default components, we're going to look at the thread component that we provide. And this is basically how it looks. By the way, I'm not only a fan of football. I'm also a fan of basketball, in case you're wondering. Wemby. Shout out to Wemby. Great. And so here we have the hooks to basically fetch all the threads. You get all the threads. Then you can loop through them through a map. And we have this thread component that lists essentially all the comments. And with those default components, we provide a set of CSS variables that people can override. And that's pretty nice because if you change the accent color, for instance, from like blue to red, it's going to apply this throughout the component. So instead of being blue, it's going to be red. And if you want to change the spacing, you can change from like 1 EM to 1.5 EM. It's going to apply the right spacing between the avatars, the timestamp, and all that stuff. And you're going to get like a nice looking component with a bit more breathing room. Mark from our team, big shout out to him. He wrote all the CSS and the React Components SDK. And he put this amazing thread together. So if you have a chance, I highly recommend looking at it and giving him a follow. He's super talented, and he wrote this thread explaining some of the behind the scenes of the things that happen in those default components. One of the things that he talks about is color mix. And you can see here through this little video, as you change the accent color, there's actually a bunch of other sub-variables that get updated through the color mix CSS property. And the way it works, essentially, we have this color mix scale, custom CSS property that we wrote that goes through post CSS, that then gets through our own TypeScript function that gets translated into color mix. And the way you interact with it as a developer in the CSS is that you write a color mix scale function that takes a background color, an accent color, a contrast percentage, and the level you want to get of like the scale itself. Kind of like the fonts. You have font weights like 400, font weight 100 is going to be a little bit lighter. And I just wanted to show this because as I was working on this talk, I went deep into the code base, and I found this comment, and I just wanted to show it. I guess the contrast is not so good, but this is one of the most beautiful comments I've ever seen. And Mark did this and explains basically all the contrast and the different levels of the colors and how that works. And I just thought it was fascinating to see that and see the care that he put into this. And so this is the TypeScript function where you basically take that color mix scale, turn it into a color mix. So here we basically get the color, the contrast, the increment, and we take that through and we return a string that returns the color mix property. So you see at the bottom here. Another thing that we did is, even if that was designed for English only at first, we use CSS logical properties to align things properly, enable things like right to left, not just left to right, and also the Intel API, which is super cool to find the right date format for things like timestamp, like 1 day ago or something like that. And the way this works, hopefully you can see this at the top. If you want to say like next to a comment like 1 minute ago, the Intel API looks like this, and I highly recommend it. You can do like a relative time format. So at the top, I'm using English, and I want to style short. And that, when you pass that, it's going to return like 1 minute ago. If you do it in French, it's going to return il y a une minute. And you can do that for every language, and that enables you to build a component that's like going to work. Doesn't matter what language you use, in what part of the world, you can make it work for everybody. If you want to dive deeper, all of this code for our React components is available on our GitHub repo. And yeah, you can have a look. All that stuff is there. You can see the comment that Mark wrote. Highly recommend. And remember, sometimes a bad situation can turn out to be good in retrospect, like talking at a conference like React Paris today, starting a company that builds React components as a service, something that didn't expect would happen. And so thank you so much for your time, and hope you have a great day. Thank you.